This is the story of Emperor Caligula and the 7 most perverted, most disturbing rituals that turned Rome into his personal playground of nightmares. Picture this. It's 37 CE, and the most powerful empire in human history is being ruled by a man so twisted that senators would rather die than attend his dinner parties. The marble halls of the Roman palace, once symbols of dignity and power, now echo with screams, forced laughter, and whispered prayers from grown men begging for mercy. Torches flicker against blood-stained walls, while trembling senators huddle in corners, knowing that at any moment, their emperor, who genuinely believes he's a living god, might decide their fate with a casual gesture. Children are dragged through these same halls by palace guards, their cries mixing with the sound of Caligula's delighted laughter as he orchestrates horrors so creative, so systematically cruel, that even Rome's battle-hardened citizens couldn't sleep at night. This isn't just the story of a mad emperor. This is the story of how one man turned an entire civilization into his personal torture chamber, and the 7 ritualized perversions that still make historians sick to their stomachs nearly 2,000 years later. The first ritual was something Caligula called his divine banquets. But trust me, these weren't your typical Roman dinner parties. These were carefully choreographed psychological warfare sessions disguised as social gatherings. And receiving an invitation wasn't an honor. It was literally a death sentence wrapped in gold leaf. Caligula had figured out something that would make modern dictators jealous. He discovered that humiliation was a far more effective weapon than execution, because a dead enemy is forgotten, but a broken enemy spreads fear to everyone around them. Picture the scene. Rome's most powerful senators, men who literally ruled provinces and commanded legions, receiving those dreaded imperial invitations sealed with Caligula's personal mark. They knew exactly what they meant. But refusing wasn't an option. That would mean immediate execution for their entire families. So they'd show up at the palace, dressed in their finest togas, hands shaking as they entered dining halls that glittered with exotic delicacies from across the empire. Golden plates, the finest wines, entertainment that would cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Caligula would be there, playing the perfect host, charming and witty, making jokes that had everyone laughing just a little too loudly because they were terrified of what would happen if they didn't. But here's where it gets absolutely twisted. Halfway through the evening, after everyone had relaxed just enough to think maybe tonight would be different, Caligula would casually turn to one of his guests, always a senator, always a married man, and make a simple request. He'd want to borrow their wife for a few minutes. Not for conversation, not for dancing. Everyone in that room knew exactly what he meant, and everyone knew that saying no wasn't an option. The senator would have to sit there, frozen, watching his wife be led away by the emperor, while the rest of the dinner guests pretended to focus on their food, the sound of their own heartbeats drowning out the awkward small talk. But Caligula wasn't done with his twisted theater. While the husband sat there, knowing exactly what was happening to his wife in the adjoining chambers, the emperor would continue the dinner party as if nothing was happening. Casual conversation about politics, jokes about the weather, discussions about the latest gladiator matches, all while every person in that room was mentally counting the minutes and wondering if they'd be next. The psychological torture wasn't just for 2. The husband whose wife had been taken, it was for everyone there, because they all knew their turn was coming eventually. Then came the part that broke these men completely. Caligula would return with the senator's wife, and in front of the entire dinner party, he would provide detailed, graphic commentary about their encounter. He'd discuss her performance like he was reviewing a theatrical production, rating her enthusiasm, describing intimate details that should never be shared, all while her humiliated husband had to sit there and nod along like he was grateful for the emperor's attention. The other wives would stare at their plates, knowing they could be next, while their husbands mentally calculated whether they could survive if they tried to leave Rome that very night. This wasn't a one-time thing. Caligula turned this into a regular entertainment, rotating through Rome's most powerful families with systematic precision. Marriage, which Romans considered sacred, became his weapon of choice for destroying the dignity of men who thought they were untouchable. He discovered that shame was sharper than any sword, and that a senator who'd been publicly humiliated through his wife would never again have the courage to challenge imperial authority. The banquets became so notorious that receiving an invitation was like being diagnosed with a terminal illness. You knew your life as you knew it was over. You just didn't know how long the dying would take. The second ritual makes the first one look like a children's tea party, because Caligula decided that the bonds of family, the most sacred connections in Roman society, were just another playground for his twisted imagination. We're talking about a man who turned incest into a public spectacle and made his dead sister into a goddess that everyone had to worship. Yes, you heard that right. He didn't just sleep with his sisters. He made it into a religious ceremony that the entire empire had to participate in. Caligula had 3 sisters, but his obsession was focused primarily on Drusilla, and he didn't even try to hide what was happening. In a society where family honor was everything, where the purity of noble bloodlines was considered sacred, the emperor was openly flaunting a relationship with his sister that would have gotten any other Roman citizen executed for crimes against the gods. But here's the thing that made it even more twisted. He didn't just have a secret affair with her. He paraded her around like she was his empress, gave her honors that were traditionally reserved for wives of emperors, and made sure everyone in Rome knew exactly what their relationship was. Roman society was built on the idea that certain boundaries could never be crossed, that some things were so fundamentally wrong that even suggesting them would bring down the wrath of the gods. Caligula looked at those boundaries and decided they were just suggestions. He'd appear at public functions with Drusilla, treating her with the kind of intimate affection that made everyone deeply uncomfortable. And the worst part was that nobody could do anything about it. Senators who'd built their careers on enforcing moral standards had to smile and nod, while their emperor openly violated every principle they'd sworn to uphold. But then Drusilla died in 38 CE. And instead of ending Caligula's obsession, her death somehow made it even worse. A normal person might have been consumed with grief. A normal emperor might have given her a respectful funeral and tried to move on. But Caligula, he declared her a goddess. Not just any goddess. He created an entirely new religious cult centered around worshiping his dead sister, with whom he'd had an incestuous relationship that everyone knew about. He erected statues of her throughout Rome, built temples in her honor, and established rituals where citizens were required to pray to the deified spirit of his sister lover. Think about how absolutely insane this was for Roman citizens. They were being forced to participate in religious ceremonies that honored a relationship that their own moral and religious laws considered an abomination. Parents had to take their children to temples dedicated to imperial incest. Priests had to perform sacred rituals that celebrated something their training told them would damn their souls. The entire religious structure of Rome was being twisted to accommodate one man's sexual obsession with his dead sister, and anyone who refused to participate would face execution for impiety against the new goddess. Caligula didn't stop there. He'd hold elaborate ceremonies where he'd claim to be in spiritual communication with the deified Drusilla, describing their conversations in detail that made everyone profoundly uncomfortable. He'd talk about how she visited him in dreams, how she gave him divine guidance, how their love transcended death itself. The man had turned necrophilia into a state religion, and he was forcing the entire Roman Empire to not just tolerate it, but to actively worship it. Senators who'd spent their lives defending traditional Roman values had to publicly praise the divine wisdom of their emperor's dead sister wife, knowing that their own families were watching and wondering what kind of world they were living in. The third ritual was Caligula's systematic destruction of the Roman Senate, but he didn't do it through political maneuvering or legal changes. Instead, he turned Rome's most powerful men into his personal entertainment, forcing them to humiliate themselves in ways that were so degrading, so publicly shameful, that their authority was completely destroyed. We're talking about senators, men who governed provinces, commanded armies, and made decisions that affected millions of people, being reduced to crawling on their hands and knees for the emperor's amusement. Picture Rome's most distinguished statesmen, men in their 60s and 70s who'd spent decades building reputations for wisdom and dignity, being forced to bow so low before Caligula that their foreheads scraped against the marble floor of the Senate chamber. These weren't brief ceremonial bows. Caligula would make them hold these positions until their backs cramped and their legs shook, all while he casually conducted other business or chatted with his friends about trivial matters. The message was clear. These men who thought they were important were nothing more than furniture in his presence. But the physical humiliation was just the beginning. Caligula discovered that Roman senators, despite all their power and wealth, were absolutely terrified of looking ridiculous in public. So he started forcing them to participate in theatrical performances that were designed to be as embarrassing as possible. We're talking about elderly, dignified men being made to dress up in costumes and perform comedy skits that mocked their own positions and achievements. Senators who delivered stirring speeches about Roman virtue were forced to play buffoons and clowns, while crowds of common citizens laughed at them. The worst part was the chariot routine. Caligula would harness these distinguished senators like horses and force them to run alongside his chariot through the streets of Rome, their expensive togas trailing in the dust while citizens lined the roads to watch the spectacle. These men who'd once commanded respect from every person in the empire were now literally being used as beasts of burden, panting and stumbling while their emperor laughed at their struggle to keep up. The psychological damage was devastating. How could anyone take orders from a senator they'd seen crawling through the streets like an animal? Caligula understood something that modern political scientists are still studying. Authority is largely psychological, and once that psychology is broken, it's almost impossible to repair. By forcing senators to humiliate themselves publicly, he wasn't just entertaining himself, he was systematically destroying their ability to govern effectively. Citizens who'd once looked up to these men as paragons of Roman virtue now saw them as pathetic figures who couldn't even maintain their own dignity. The Senate, which had been the backbone of Roman governance for centuries, became a joke that nobody took seriously anymore. The kissing ritual was perhaps the most degrading of all. Caligula would summon senators to public gatherings and force them to crawl forward and kiss his sandals while crowds watched. Not a quick ceremonial kiss. He'd make them linger there, sometimes for minutes at a time, while he chatted with other people or deliberately ignored them entirely. These were men who'd once negotiated with foreign kings as equals, who'd commanded legions in battle, who'd shaped the laws that governed the civilized world. Now they were groveling at the feet of a man who was barely old enough to shave, their humiliation serving as entertainment for the very citizens they were supposed to lead. The fourth ritual was perhaps the most terrifying of all, because it made death into a random game where survival had nothing to do with loyalty, competence, or even basic human decency. Caligula had discovered that predictable tyranny, while certainly effective, wasn't nearly as psychologically devastating as completely arbitrary cruelty. When people understand the rules, even terrible rules, they can at least try to follow them and hope for survival. But when there are no rules at all, when death can strike anyone at any time for no reason whatsoever, it creates a level of terror too. It paralyzes entire populations. Picture Roman citizens waking up every morning not knowing if this would be the day they'd be randomly selected for execution, not because they'd committed crimes, not because they'd opposed the emperor, not even because they'd accidentally offended someone important, simply because Caligula was bored and felt like watching someone die. He'd have guards patrol the streets and randomly select citizens for immediate execution, turning the entire city into a giant lottery where the prize was getting to live another day. During public festivals, when families gathered to celebrate religious holidays or important civic events, Caligula would interrupt the festivities with impromptu executions. He'd have his guards drag random people from the crowd, sometimes children, sometimes elderly people, sometimes pregnant women, and execute them on the spot while their families watched. The message was terrifyingly clear. No one was safe, no matter how innocent, no matter how uninvolved in politics, no matter how careful they were to stay out of trouble. But Caligula didn't just want people dead. He wanted their deaths to be as psychologically damaging as possible to everyone who witnessed them. He'd force family members to watch each other being tortured and killed, often making parents watch their children die, or making children watch their parents suffer through prolonged, agonizing deaths. These weren't quick executions designed to maintain order. They were elaborate torture sessions designed to break the spirits of everyone who survived them. The unpredictability was the worst part. Roman citizens had lived through bad emperors before, but even the worst of them had some kind of logic to their cruelty. You could avoid trouble by staying loyal, keeping quiet, or simply being too unimportant to notice. But Caligula's violence was completely racist. And being loyal didn't protect you, being quiet didn't help you, and being unimportant just meant you'd die without anyone even remembering your name.
Rome became a city where people were afraid to leave their houses, afraid to attend public gatherings, afraid to let their children play in the streets, because death could strike anywhere at any time for no reason at all. Citizens started avoiding eye contact with imperial guards, crossing streets to avoid walking near palace officials, and teaching their children to run and hide whenever they saw anyone wearing imperial colors. Rome, which had been a bustling, confident metropolis, became a city of whispers and shadows where people lived in constant fear of randomly becoming the day's entertainment for an emperor who treated human lives like dice in a cosmic game of chance. The fifth ritual was so degrading, so fundamentally offensive to everything Romans considered sacred about social hierarchy and family honor, that even hardened historians struggled to record it accurately. Caligula had decided that the Palatine Hill Palace, the sacred seat of imperial power, the place where Augustus had established the dignity of the Roman Empire, should be converted into a brothel. But not just any brothel. He was going to force Rome's noble families to work there as prostitutes, turning the empire's most distinguished citizens into sex workers for the entertainment of common people. Picture the wives and daughters of senators, women who'd been raised from birth to embody Roman virtue and nobility, being forced to offer their bodies to anyone who could pay the fee that Caligula had set. These weren't women who'd chosen this life or had any experience with it. They were aristocrats who'd never even spoken to a common citizen, without several layers of protocol and ceremony. Now, they were being displayed like merchandise while their husbands and fathers were forced to act as their pimps, collecting money from customers and pretending to be grateful for the emperor's attention
Their families. The psychological warfare aspect of this was absolutely brilliant in its cruelty. Caligula understood that Roman society was built on rigid social hierarchies, and that the nobility maintained their power partly through the mystique of being fundamentally different from and superior to common people. By forcing aristocratic women to serve common citizens sexually, he was destroying that mystique in the most humiliating way possible. How could anyone respect a senator's authority when they'd paid money to sleep with his daughter the night before? But it got worse. Caligula would personally inspect these women like he was examining livestock, commenting on their appearance and performance in front of their families, making suggestions about how they could better serve their customers, and sometimes even providing detailed critiques of their techniques. Imagine being a Roman patriarch, a man whose authority had been unquestioned for decades, having to stand there while the emperor discussed your wife's sexual performance like he was reviewing a theatrical production. The male members of noble families weren't spared either. Caligula forced senators and their sons to serve as attendants and entertainers in this imperial brothel, making them perform degrading tasks that would have been considered beneath even slaves in normal circumstances. These men who'd once commanded legions and governed provinces were now cleaning up after sex workers and helping common citizens select their partners from among Rome's former aristocracy. The palace, which had been a symbol of Roman dignity and imperial power, became known throughout the city as the House of Shame. Citizens would come not just for the services, but to gawk at the spectacle of seeing their former social superiors reduced to such degrading circumstances. The psychological damage was permanent. Even after Caligula's death, many of these families never recovered their social standing because too many people remembered seeing them in circumstances that made respect impossible. The sixth ritual was Caligula's demand that he be worshipped as a living god, which might not sound that unusual since Roman emperors were often deified after death. But Caligula didn't want to wait for death. He wanted divine honors immediately, and he wanted them performed in ways that mocked and perverted every religious tradition that Romans held sacred. We're talking about forced worship ceremonies that were so blasphemous, so offensive to traditional Roman religious sensibilities, that they nearly triggered revolts across the empire. Caligula started by demanding that statues of himself be placed in temples throughout the Roman world, not alongside the traditional gods, but replacing them entirely. Citizens who'd worshipped Jupiter, Mars, and Venus for their entire lives were suddenly being told that their neighborhood temples were now dedicated exclusively to their 20-something emperor, who claimed to have conversations with the gods like they were his personal friends. The priests, many of whom had dedicated their lives to serving traditional deities, were forced to perform ceremonies honoring Caligula or face execution for impiety. But static worship wasn't enough for him. Caligula would dress up as different gods and demand that people worship him in character. One day, he'd appear as Mercury, complete with winged sandals and a caduceus,
demanding that citizens pray to him for safe travels and successful business ventures. The next day, he'd dress as Venus, wearing flowing robes and makeup, insisting that couples pray to him for successful marriages and fertility. The day after that, he'd appear as Mars in full military regalia, demanding that soldiers sacrifice to him before battle. The theatrical aspect of this blasphemy was what made it so psychologically devastating. Roman religion was built on centuries of tradition, solemn rituals, and deep spiritual
significance. Caligula turned it into a costume party where he was the star performer and everyone else was forced to pretend they believed in the performance. Citizens had to participate in prayer ceremonies that felt like elaborate jokes, knowing that their spiritual beliefs were being mocked while simultaneously being forced to participate in the mockery. The Jerusalem temple incident nearly broke his empire apart. When Caligula decided that his statue should be placed in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, one of the most sacred sites in the ancient world, he came closer to triggering a massive revolt than any emperor before him. The Jews, who'd been remarkably tolerant of Roman rule for decades, were prepared to die en masse rather than allow such blasphemy in their holy place. Only Caligula's assassination prevented what could have been a religious war that might have torn the empire apart. Citizens throughout the Roman world were forced to participate in prayer sessions where they had to address their emperor using the names and titles of traditional gods, asking him for divine favors and protection. The psychological dissonance was overwhelming. People had to speak prayers they knew were meaningless to a man they knew was mortal, while pretending to believe that he had the power to control their destinies. Religion, which had been a source of comfort and meaning for countless generations, became another arena where Caligula could demonstrate his power to force people to abandon their most deeply held beliefs. The seventh and final ritual was so horrifying that even the historians who lived through it could barely bring themselves to record what they'd witnessed. We're talking about systematic torture and murder that was choreographed like theatrical performances, with Caligula directing the proceedings like he was staging elaborate entertainment spectacles. The whispered rumors about what happened to the victims' bodies afterward, rumors that historians couldn't verify but couldn't entirely dismiss,
have haunted the historical record for nearly 2,000 years. Caligula had discovered that quick executions, while certainly effective for eliminating enemies, weren't nearly as psychologically devastating as prolonged torture sessions that could last for hours or even days. He'd have victims brought before him in public settings and then proceed to torture them with methodical precision, explaining his techniques to the watching crowd like he was conducting an educational seminar on the science of human suffering. The goal wasn't just to kill. It was to break the victim so completely that everyone who watched would be traumatized by the experience. Families were tortured together, with Caligula forcing parents to choose which of their children would suffer first, or making children watch their parents endure unimaginable agony. The psychological torture was often worse than the physical torture. Victims would be kept alive and conscious while Caligula described in detail what he planned to do to their loved ones, making them complicit in their family's suffering by forcing them to make impossible choices about who would be hurt and how. But then there were the rumors about what happened after the torture sessions ended. Rumors so disturbing that most historians refused to investigate them thoroughly. Whispered stories about elaborate dinner parties where the menu included dishes that no one could quite identify, where guests were served meals that tasted unusual and left them feeling sick for reasons they couldn't explain. Stories about Caligula making cryptic comments about the origins of certain delicacies, about his jokes regarding where he'd acquired such exotic ingredients. The rumors suggested that some of Rome's noble families didn't just disappear after their torture sessions. They ended up being served at subsequent imperial banquets, with Caligula King's sadistic pleasure in watching unknowing guests consume meals prepared from people they might have known personally. Whether these rumors were true or just products of a traumatized population's imagination, they spread throughout Rome and created a level of horror that went beyond anything even that violence-accustomed society had ever experienced. What made these stories so psychologically devastating wasn't just their content, it was the fact that they were believable. Caligula had already proven himself capable of such systematic cruelty that citizens could easily imagine him taking that final step into literal cannibalism.
Even if the rumors weren't true, the fact that people believed they might be true reveals just how completely he destroyed any sense of safety or sanity in Roman society. The torture sessions became so notorious that even hardened Roman soldiers, men who'd seen combat in brutal frontier wars, would request transfers rather than serve as palace guards. The few records that survive suggest that Caligula's cruelty wasn't random or impulsive. It was systematic and carefully planned, as if he was conducting experiments to see how much psychological damage he could inflict on both his victims and the people forced to witness their suffering. For 4 years, from 37 to 41 CE, the Roman Empire was ruled by a man who'd turned systematic cruelty into an art form, who'd perverted every institution and tradition that Romans considered sacred, and who'd created a reign of terror so complete that citizens were afraid to sleep at night because they didn't know what fresh horror would greet them in the morning. But on January 24th, 41 CE, a group of his own Praetorian guards finally decided they'd had enough. The assassination wasn't a grand conspiracy or a dramatic political revolt. It was just a handful of men who'd been forced to participate in and witnessed so much horror that they couldn't stand it anymore. They cornered Caligula in a palace corridor and stabbed him repeatedly, ending 4 years of systematic madness with a few quick blade strikes. The man who'd claimed to be a living god died like any other mortal, bleeding out on the marble floor, while his killers stood over him in relief rather than triumph. When news of his death spread through Rome, there was no mourning, no period of respectful grief, no ceremonies honoring his memory. Instead, there was an almost palpable sense of relief, as if the entire city had been holding its breath for 4 years and could finally exhale. Citizens emerged from their homes like survivors of a plague, blinking in sunlight they'd almost forgotten existed, trying to rebuild lives that had been shattered by a man who'd turned their civilization into his personal torture chamber. But the damage Caligula had done couldn't be undone with his death. The families he'd destroyed, the institutions he'd perverted, the psychological trauma he'd inflicted on an entire empire, these scars lasted for generations. His name became synonymous with the worst possibilities of unchecked power, a warning about what happens when someone with unlimited authority decides that human decency is just another rule to be broken for entertainment. Nearly 2,000 years later, we're still talking about Caligula, not because he was a great emperor or because he achieved anything meaningful for his empire, but because he represents something that terrifies us about human nature: the capacity for systematic cruelty that goes beyond mere political oppression into realms of perversion that most people can't even imagine. His 7 rituals weren't just the actions of a mad emperor. They were a systematic exploration of how far human cruelty can go when it's given unlimited power and no restraints. The truly horrifying thing about Caligula's story isn't that one man was capable of such systematic evil. It's that an entire civilization, one of the most advanced and powerful in human history, was so paralyzed by fear that they allowed it to continue for 4 years. It's a reminder that the institutions we depend on to protect us from tyranny are only as strong as the people who run them, and that civilization itself is far more fragile than most of us want to believe.